Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Catholic Culture Podcast. My guest today is returning from a previous appearance when he came on to discuss his book of translations, Proteus Bound. Ryan Wilson is an excellent poet and translator, and we did a long interview with him before, and today we've got him back to discuss his two most recent books. First, his second book of original poems, In Ghostlight, and also a volume he co-edited with April Lindner, Contemporary Catholic Poetry, an anthology. And I'm really happy to have him back on. Ryan Wilson, welcome back.
Thanks so much, Thomas. Really happy to be back. We had such a wonderful conversation last time. Hopefully this time we can keep it under 3.5 hours or whatever it was a couple of years ago.
That was a long one. We'll be shorter this time. And now you've just taken on a new teaching post, haven't you?
Yeah, that's right. After many years at the Catholic University of America, I'm now at the University of St. Thomas, Houston, full-time. Last year I taught graduate classes for them, but this year I am on, as I say, full-time, and I've moved to Texas. And,
wow.
Thus far, enjoying it very much.
Great. Okay. Wow. Okay. So in Ghostlight, this is your second volume of original poetry. And we're going to read a few of these, but is there any general comments you want to make about this collection and this stage of your career before we get into specific poems?
Sure. First, I should say that I'm very, very grateful to be at LSU Press, which is a press that I've admired my entire adult life. When I was an undergraduate and first discovering contemporary poetry, so many of the poets that I like best were publishing with LSU, especially Southern poets. And one of those is a poet called Dave Smith. And I was so crazy about Dave Smith's poems that I looked him up and found that he taught at Johns Hopkins. And so when I applied to graduate school, I applied to one place, Johns Hopkins, to study with Dave Smith. And after I graduated, we stayed in touch and became pals. And very happily, Dave is the editor of the series, the Southern Messenger Poets series that my book is a part of. In terms of, the book itself, I would say it's a continuation of the work that I've been doing, starting with The Stranger World, where the fundamental theme, I suppose, is Xenia, right? Hospitality to the stranger. And then in Proteus Bound, practicing hospitality toward, so many poets across millennia and languages. And in Ghostlight is another version of the same project. Without giving too much away, I'll say that, behind the notion for this book, there's something of a pun. In Old English, the word for breath or spirit is gast. Right? In almost every language, breath and spirit are the same thing. Spiros in Greek, spiritus in Latin. So it's gast, and the plural of gast is geest, and the singular geest, the same spelling and everything, means guest. And so there's a little bit of an overlap to the notion of hospitality to the stranger and ultimately to ghost, to the spirit, and being open to the spirit. Yeah.
And a lot of these poems do have this kind of ghostly theme. There's a lot of things about, shades of the past and past places, past people, ancestors, people who are alive now but sort of inhabit the world like shades, who don't really seem to be fully present or at home. Some of these poems, take place in kind of like a southern rural setting, for instance, just describing the landscape and broken down houses and stuff like that. And, I don't want to, say any cliches here because I don't know that much about like the whole Southern Gothic thing, but is that sort of part of a tradition that you're working in as a Southerner?
Well, to an extent, right? It's commonplace now, I think, to talk about Flannery O'Connor and the Christ-haunted South, and the idea of the South as a haunted place is very common, right? And in the Southern Gothic, we see that in a writer like Faulkner. We're going to see it in O'Connor. So there's some of that, right? I grew up about 30 miles from Andalusia, where O'Connor lived. There's definitely, an awareness of that tradition. But, I would also say that language is a fundamentally haunted instrument. All of our words carry with them the past. They come from the past. Even when I'm inventing new words, as I like to do, they almost exclusively come from Greek or Latin words that haven't yet made it over into English, or in some cases stealing a technique. In some of the poems in this book, I use agglutinative nouns in the way that German does, and that English typically doesn't. A lot of the forms in the book are obviously very ancient or are adaptations of ancient forms. In some cases, I've broken the lineation of the poem against a traditional form so that if you say the poem aloud, you can hear the traditional form, haunting a poem that looks like it is soi-disant free verse. So lots of hauntings all throughout. But as I say, it comes down to language being a haunted instrument. Whenever we are using language, we are, to an extent, conjuring. We're conjuring an experience. We're conjuring a memory. And very important to this book, central to this book, is St. Augustine's discussion of memory in the late books of the Confessions. And Augustine's notion, which was not original to him, but his notion that memory, in effect, abuts the divine, because it's a sort of spiritualizing.
So actually on that topic, a good one to talk about with memory would be For a Dog. Do you mind starting with that one?
Sure, absolutely. And you're correct that this is a poem that is freighted with memory. So, For a Dog. You'd wake us up. That shrill, insistent bark, driving away whatever dreams had fogged our vision. And we'd rise in the true dark, wondering just what exactly, cataloged by canine instinct under threat, was there. What jogger, cat, or dog it was that dogged you from your drowse beside the easy chair and summoned your yapped pandemonium. 9 times in 10, it was just empty air, some ghosted scent you sniffed. Dumb. You were dumb, like all dogs, snuffling up to snakes, afraid of mice. When we said, come, you wouldn't come. You capered when commanded to play dead, and when we wanted most to be alone, you'd offer up that imbecilic head until we crowned your pity with a bone. Our lives took on the shape you spun from need, the harried rondure of routine. You gone, the house is quieter, and we've been freed forever from the never-ending chores your tale entailed. The scrubbing where you peed, the hunting stain removers down in stores. What's hardest are the peaceful hours we wanted so much, when you were scratching up the doors and howling at some phantom thing that haunted the world without, some threat we couldn't see that you were desperate to have confronted. Now, you're part of that present unity of absences the living move among, in which what was, what will, and what can't be dance in a ring to a triumphant song we don't have ears to hear or heart to see, who sleep now perfectly and much too long.
Great, thank you. Yeah, a lot of your poems have this idea that we're not living in this kind of like fresh, clean world where if that makes sense, is everything is kind of reset, and only the people who are here, and we're not unburdened by what has been, and so so there are these presences, whether they be historical memory, the actual just the effects of the past on us, the effects of our parents, people who came before, or even maybe like actual spiritual presences, in some cases. But what strikes me, and this is one of your poems that I've read a few times over the years, this idea at the end of in which what was, what will, and what can't be dance in a ring to a triumphant song we don't have ears to hear or heart to see. And what's striking to me about that is, specifically in the case of animals that don't have immortal souls, what is their part in reality over time, even after they're gone? When you talk about what was, what will, and what can't be, I also think about how everything is present to God. Obviously, this is a theme in Augustine too, right? And so even these creatures that don't have immortal souls are still present to him. There's still kind of a reality that is of lasting relevance. They're a part of the world story, but they're also ever present to God. Is that something that you think about in terms of? I hadn't thought about this before, but the specifically the world of purely mortal creatures and things that really do pass away definitively in a sense, and yet that there's still some eternal significance to them.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. There is no death in a certain sense, because every being changes, right? Nothing can be completely erased. Whether it's just a memory living on as opposed to the immortal soul and the communion of saints, even if it's just that memory never goes away. That being, the influence of that being on someone's lives, on many people's lives, never goes away, and it ripples out. And I think so much in this particular poem is about escaping the conscious mind, escaping the ego that so often wants to build a replica of the world and mistake that replica for the world itself. It's easy for us to think that our understanding of the world is the world, but it's important to remember that's not the case. And very often it is the inconvenience that is the opportunity for grace and for discovery. It's the thing that annoys us that is an opportunity for us to step outside our habitual thoughts and see things afresh. And creatures are very good at affording those opportunities for, I think, discoveries of grace, and certainly for learning patience. Anyone who's had a dog probably has learned a lot of patience, or else has gone insane. That would be my guess.
Okay, well, as we discuss, I'm sort of rearranging the poems into a different order than I originally planned on, based on where we go in the conversation. So on that note, would you mind reading The Problem? This is the last poem in the book.
Yeah. So there's a Felicitas that I wanted to mention. I was just talking about the Aeneid, and I wasn't doing that necessarily on purpose, but The For a Dog in this version, I've published it in memory of my beloved dog Achates Baudelaire. He was named Achates because Aeneas's best friend in the Aeneid is Achates, and the heroic epithet for Achates is Fidus, faithful, as in Fido. So very nerdy Latin things happening on this end.
I see.
Still some nerdy Latin things will be happening in The Problem. It's maybe a segue. The poem is, in genre, it's a propempticon, which is a poem for one going on a journey. The most famous propempticon from antiquity is Horace's Ode 1-3, which happens to be dedicated to his friend Virgil. So we're just looping around here with Virgil, apparently. In any case, so it blends the genre of the propempticon, the poem for someone going on a journey, with a genre called the preamel, which is in antiquity is most famous in its iteration of Sappho, that Sappho wrote, where she's saying, some people like riding horses, some people like war, some people like this, what I like is love, right? So it's blending these ancient genres. And it's also haunted formally, in a sense. So it has the rhyme scheme of a sonnet, but it has very long lines of the length that you might see in somebody like Walt Whitman. And there are several poems like that in this book, which I, with a joke at my own expense, I think, playfully call Will sonnets. Get it? Wilson sonnets.
Yeah.
Wilson. Yeah, it's terrible. It's brutal. I know, it's awful. But the origin of this form is actually in the French Catholic poet Paul Claudel.
Okay, yeah. So I know what you're talking about with the, it's sort of like, is it like sort of quasi-free verse, like in the great odes?
Well, in the Saint Grand Ode, he doesn't rhyme the way that he does in his lyrics. So the so-called versicle delien, basically, he would take a form like the ballade, a traditional form of the sonnet, and he would keep the rhyme scheme, but then he would write just these very, very long lines. And so it creates a tension between the uplift of musicality in verse, the rising up of that musicality, and a sort of flattened out kind of prosaic presentation. And so as a form, it's a little bit of a liminal space, right? An in-between space. And it's, fun to explore in this direction. And maybe I should also, as a preface, note that the poem is for one of my dearest friends who, some years ago, shortly after he and his wife welcomed their second daughter, it was discovered he had a brain tumor and chronic heart failure. And then there were tumors discovered all over his body. And they were, to use what apparently medicos say, they were hot or appeared to be hot. And so we did not think that he had a long time. So I wrote this poem for him, The Problem. Some grouse. Some rattle ice in stormy cocktails. Some read or stare into their hands' artificial glow. The good-natured, whom no one likes, make conversation. Kids kick seat backs. Babies scream. This is the part where you find out exactly who you are, as much as you will ever know. Crammed like seeds into this invaluable lemon with all the dreamed escapes you cannot help but dream. There's something wrong, some unspecified glitch. But nobody will say just what it is, keeping you stranded among strangers here on the hot tarmac, waiting for some pronouncement, some true words that will explain your prolonged absences from the air above the clouds, from flight, from the oceanfront destination everyone's anticipating. It will not last forever, your time on the ground. At some point, there will come a departure. Then, clouded skies will recede, like sunshine, like questions, like your toddler's sticky touch. And you will be wholly invisible to the earthlings you love, who love you. An arrow shot by some blind archer beyond the endless traffic and grocery store pharmacy lines, long-distance calls and doctors wincing thoughtlessly. For now, take solace in the presence of the known world's flawed, forgettable, flightless things. Bless the engine's troubled heart, the brief and inexplicably beautiful problem with the wings.
Yeah, so interesting, that the similarities with another poem we're going to read too, another one of my favorites that involves wings and the word flaw at the end. Very, very interesting, and I'm sure you place those poems next to each other in the book, on purpose. You've been referencing, classical literature here,
Mm-hmm.
and the last time one of the original one, I don't know if we read more than one of your poems or maybe two of them last time, but one of them was your poem Philoctetes Long Afterward, which is kind of like a modern day retelling of the story of the companion of one of the Greek fighters in the Trojan War, Philoctetes. And in this poem, you have that one. We won't read that one again, but there's another one that takes a similar approach, Behind the Music. And this one's about Orpheus, right?
Yeah.
And the title refers to VH1, Behind the Music, I'm assuming.
That's correct.
Yeah, which some people may not remember, but I somehow remember, even though I wasn't allowed to watch TV as a kid, I still sort of knew about it. So,
right. Yeah. So, I saw some of those in the 90s, this series Behind the Music that VH1 would run. And it was, what I remember was primarily the guys from the hair metal bands, who were so terribly behaved. And, and they're coming on and describing, what was going on, and, the most outrageous, unbelievable things, but it had always been on my mind to do a version of that with Orpheus, right? The great poet, singer, mythological poet, singer of antiquity. Incidentally, the Orpheus and Eurydice myth first appears in Virgil's Georgics, just so we get in our obligatory Virgil mention.
Very interesting.
The poem, I think. But right, so to try to retell this famous myth, right, about a lover who, when his beloved, Eurydice, is being chased, she's bitten by a snake, she dies, she goes down into Hades. Orpheus is grief-stricken. He descends into Hades, and he sings so sweetly that he charms Cerberus, the three-headed dog. He charms all the shades. The ghosts come around and listen to him sing. It's so beautiful. And Hades is convinced to let Eurydice return with Orpheus. The song is so beautiful. And there's one condition, that until they've reached the world above, until they've come into the land of the living again, Orpheus can't look back. And of course, on the verge of the light, just right at the very edge, he worries that Eurydice may not be following him up the path, that something may have happened. He looks back, and she's swept away back into the realm of the dead forever. And Orpheus, after this, is so distraught that he goes around singing his laments, and they're so beautiful that the trees and the rivers and the creatures all sing along with him. And the Maenads are the devotees of Bacchus, and they rip Orpheus apart in a bacchanalian fit. They rip Orpheus apart the way that they would normally rip Dionysus apart, the fertility god. And as Orpheus's severed head is floating down the river Hebrus, it's still calling out, Eurydice, Eurydice.
Wow.
Very beautiful, beautiful story about the limits of art, right? That art can bring the ghost, bring the past right to the edge, but it can't bring it back to life, right?
Oh, yeah. Well, that's very interesting. I'm glad you told the whole story, because I only knew that up to that point where he fails to bring her out of Hades. I actually didn't know what ended up happening to Orpheus. And so now I understand more of the poem now that you've explained that. I wasn't quite sure what I knew who the Maenads are, but I didn't know how they were connected to Orpheus. So,
yeah.
And he is the singer. He is like the sort of mystical singer of the ancient world. There's these, Orphic rites and, all this stuff. And, so it's very interesting. The hair metal connection kind of works for the descent to the underworld, and
and the way that we treat, there's sort of an oblique commentary on the way that our culture sort of creates popular stars to rip them apart. This pattern happens over and again, and one hesitates to compare Bret Michaels from Poison with Orpheus, but
right.
There are some analogs at least. So anyway, the goal in this poem was to sort of undercut the grand mythology presented by Virgil, presented by Ovid as well, and do a sort of modern retelling, as you mentioned. And for that, I chose a difficult challenge for myself. So the stanza that I use in this poem is the ballad stanza. So it is the stanza of Every Rose Has Its Thorn by Poison. It's the stanza that, almost every hymn is written in. It's the stanza, most songs are in. Right. And on the page, if you're writing a poem in the stanza, it really wants to sing. The meter, the rhymes, it wants to sing. And I thought, let me see if I have enough technical ability to make it talk instead of singing, right? That is to move the singing to the background, the sort of grand
hence the beyond the music, where the focus is on the stories, not the actual songs.
Indeed. Precisely. Yes. Okay. So behind the music, and there's a little epigraph from Virgil's Georgics to help readers know that this is about Orpheus. So Eurydice says, What is this, unhappy Orpheus? This madness that's undone both you and me. The Maenads were another story. Only blank years could wear away the otherworldly glory he dreamed. Only despair could tame that wild tongue with the truth. Even with her in Hades, he'd spritz his vodka with vermouth and let drinks conjure ladies sprawling before him, fawning over the brave, the sensitive genius who'd stormed hell for his lover. Dreams are one way to live. So, one night, he typed out a dream. Great loss, he knew, needs closure. To say he'd been ripped limb from limb, resolved into composure, what otherwise was open-ended. It calmed the sea to glass, one might say. Well, it was too splendid a lie. shriller than brass and broad sun, but he knew the tale would be loved, being easy enough to pacify love's failures. Alive, he hid in sleazy all-night dives, downing martinis alone in the timeless dark. Got old, while lithe girls in bikinis lay tanning in the park with rich tech kids who'd never heard of him or his doomed passion. Got older, when he learned the word itself was out of fashion. And yet lived, crooked, drunk, and hoary, beyond the nameless pain he'd known, beyond his dream of glory. An ancient man made sane by senselessness. In his last weeks, he wrote, much to his credit, a song through which the sad truth speaks cleanly. Few have read it.
In the context of a musician who has lived this debauched lifestyle, as the behind the music kind of idea, and lived through it to become somewhat sober, we all have known let's say converts or former recovered addicts who sort of romanticize and are always talking about their sordid past because it's exciting and kind of but the other people who have truly moved on, and are not somehow trying to get attention or trying to mythologize their past, something like that.
Right.
Interesting.
Yeah. So it's about that discovery, and even in our art, right? Our culture likes art that is sort of histrionic, sort of performative. Generally speaking, we like things that make a loud noise. And often, a lot of the best artists don't make the loudest noise. They tend to be quieter. Beyond the histrionics of, this tale, oh, I was ripped apart. It's easy to play these things up, and harder to live with the knowledge of continuance, that things go on. There are terrible tragedies, and we go on. We go on living. We adapt. That's sometimes harder to face.
I'm reading just now for the first time St. Augustine's City of God. And of course, he's ripping apart the Roman pantheon and things like that. And there's other Christian thinkers who have taken varying approaches to pagan mythology. C.S. Lewis trying to find deep truths hidden in the myths and stuff like that. These two poems are the one I mentioned on Philoctetes, and this one operate in a somewhat satirical mode. But is there when you're looking at ancient myths, and I don't even mean in terms of literature, in terms of one particular ancient writer's presentation of them, like a Virgil or so on, is there a standard mode that you find yourself operating in terms of how you read them, what you get out of them, how you interpret them? Is there a particular sort of hermeneutic that you use to read myths? Because obviously there's a million different, you can approach them as fables given by demons to deceive men, or the vain imaginings of poets, and all these different things, and there's a lot of truth to that. And then there's many different approaches insofar as they are inventions of poets. They might have some deeper truth to them, even though they are impious to say of the gods or whatever. So I'm just curious, how do you find yourself approaching these kinds of stories when you have read about them?
Yeah, I mean, maybe it would help to start by saying that we can think of poetry as being in the middle of a couple of different things and sort of moving between those things. On the one hand, poetry is between music and painting, right? Horace tells us ut pictura poesias, right? In poetry as in painting, but he tells us that in heroic hexameter, right? So there's a blend, right? And poetry is sort of in the middle, right? And similarly, poetry is in the middle of history and philosophy or theology, right? Poetry is not plain history, right? It's not, what we want to go to understand the, historical facts of a case. But it's also not philosophy, not in a straightforward way. It's not theology, not in a straightforward way. Certainly it's not modern philosophy, which is abstract. It's in between. Poetry wants to lift up aspects of history toward the philosophical, toward the ideal, or vice versa. It wants to embody the ideal in time. So there's a confluence there, right, which we get when, say, Plato defines poetry as tin musikin kai ta metra, right, as music, and metra can be translated as meter, or it can be translated as rhythm. Well, that seems plain enough. Okay, poetry is music and rhythm. But if we think about what Plato means by music, the etymon of music, right? It's muse, right? So there's something divine entering into time, right? That's what rhythm is. Rhythm is in time, is in terrestrial time. And there's something metaphysical entering into time. So the Greeks had two words for time. They had chronos, which we might call ordinary time, not in the theological sense, but right, just every day. And then there is the instance of the entrance into chronos of the divine, and that they called kairos, right? Christ's first words in the Gospel of Mark are, "O kairos has been fulfilled," right? And it's this extraordinary moment in time. And so when Plato says tin musikin kai ta metra, he means this confluence, this kairos of the infinite in the finite, of the metaphysical in the physical, this harmonizing together, right? Which is going to be fulfilled, of course, in the kenosis of Christ, when God comes into time. And thereafter, we live always in time and in eternity at the same time, right? The things that we do here on earth in time last for eternity. They have eternal consequences, right? As well as temporal consequences. So I mention all of that because the way that I think about myth is in a similar thing, that a myth tells generally a kind of truth, but rather than it being abstract, it is embodied in a story. And so the way that we use myth now, when people say, you'll see headlines on the internet, it's, like 7 myths that, the political party says. We use it as a euphemism for a lie, but a myth is not a lie. A myth is an eternal truth told in a way that's indirect, that's embodied, and so does not resolve into an easy abstract summary. You can't say, well, the moral is this. The myth resists that. There are many interpretations, as you mentioned, that can be put on any myth, and it resists all of them. It is itself. And a poem is something like that too, I think. A successful poem can be understood sometimes in some different ways. It doesn't mean whatever anybody wants it to mean. That's gibberish that people have introduced somehow. It's impossible. That's not how language works. But there can be different interpretations. There are different angles of vision from which we can look at poems. And the angle from which we're looking will determine what we see, right? And I think it's the same thing with those myths. And so lots of people will end up in different places, in terms of how they think about myths.
Do you think it could be the case that some of those myths are lies even on the symbolic level, though? Like, even if you don't take them to be literally stories about the gods or something like that? That's sort of what I wonder. Like, there seems to be like the C.S. Lewis approach, and granted, I haven't read him on this a lot, but the way people talk about it seems to be that the assumption that these myths do sort of by category contain these deep truths, as opposed to some of them might, and some of them, like any other work of fiction, right, might actually lead you in the wrong direction, even on a symbolic or moral kind of level.
Yeah, I think that's plausible, Thomas. I'm sure there are lots of really bad myths. Most of those, I think, were weeded out through time. Most of the myths that we receive, that come down to us, that have lasted this long, have lasted precisely because there is truth to them.
So you'd say they're compelling for a reason, compelling even to people who don't believe they're literally stories about the gods for a reason.
Exactly. Yeah. And they speak to the psyche very often, and to the psyche's state. So if you take a simple one, right, we can think about the first in Ovid, in the Metamorphoses, after the creation of the world, which is partly like Lucretius and partly like Genesis. It's really fascinating. That was one of Shakespeare's favorite bits, and he stole from it all the time in his plays. But after that, when we get to what we would think of as sort of standard myths, the first one is I believe it's Apollo and is it Daphne? Maybe. But basically, there's a young lady, and Apollo is in love, and the young lady runs away from Apollo, and so is transformed into a reed. And on one level, you think, what does that mean? But right, we can take this in a pretty simple theological way that's applicable very much to modernity. When the human person flees the divine, the human person dehumanizes himself and lowers himself from his proper situation beneath the angels, lowers himself to a lower form of life by fleeing the divine, right? So, turning into a reed that then you can play as a pipe, what do you make of that? I don't know, right? I mean, there are fascinating ways that these things can be interpreted, but it's my suspicion that there's a great deal of wisdom in these myths that have lasted for so long. Some of them, I'm sure, are frivolous, and I feel like I've even read some that seem to me frivolous and hokey and far-fetched and just fantastical and sort of like nonsense. But those don't stick with me. I've even forgotten where I found them.
I see. All right, great. So speaking of the eternity breaking into ordinary time, could you please read Christmas Party?
Yeah, great. Christmas Party. One more dead party. And off to the side, among the knickknacks and the curios, in a blue blazer, you assume the pose of one whose patterned noose is loosely tied, of one belonging here, one clearly meant for artificial lights and merriment. The revelers, snug in their ugly sweaters, swill booze and bellow their inanities on weather and the decorated trees, which, shackled in their brightly colored fetters, like those depressives cast in festive roles, suggest the straightening of certain souls by circumstance and expectation's bonds. Those somber ones who, in time's echoes reeling, can find no word to name their thought or feeling, no thing with which the spirit corresponds, but go on going on, keep showing up to sip punch out of someone else's cup. Bless them. Bless all the wanderers who move through shadowed wastes of memory and desire, whose native realms a fraudulent empire that slips the grasp like smoke or hopeless love. And bless that hallowed world which no names name, where we're all citizens and loved the same. Into our talk, its emissaries steal to bring us tidings of what we forget. Its kingdom holds what's past and what's not yet. Its language is the language of the real, which we hear in each momentary pause in conversation, whispering its laws. As now, outside, snow whispers to the earth the secrets of the darkness that's the sky. Listen, and listen to the earth's reply, the pregnant silence of that virgin birth that gives each moment hope, and hears us in a falling blizzard lift faint cheers.
Great, thank you. This one has the theme of shades or ghost-like people, but also that theme of wisdom coming in the sort of the spaces we think of dead spaces, in our lives, like the waiting on the airplane or the things we were talking about in some of the other poems. That's one of my favorites in the book.
Well, thank you. And yes, precisely, right? As in the dog poem, inconvenience and annoyance is an opportunity for grace. So what seems like vacancy, what seems like emptiness, is a place for meditation, for beyond meditation, for contemplation. And when we lose those things, when we busy ourselves every moment, we fill our internal lives with clutter and disorder. And one of the most important things, I think, for writers, for anyone, is to find that space to be quiet and to be alone with yourself, to be alone with God, to be quiet, to sit still. Let us sit still and contemplate the true. If I can paraphrase Plato there.
Great. Do you mind reading one of many Centurions?
Sure. Yeah. So
this one's dedicated to Dana Gioia.
Right. Yeah. When The Stranger World, my first book, came out, I think 4 people might have read it. And of those 4 people, I think 3 of them said something like, there aren't any, overtly Catholic poems in this book. So I thought I would put in a few that are just, pretty squarely on the nose here. So this is one of 2 poems that, in the book, back to back, this and Wind Advisory, that are, in a sense, Good Friday poems near the end of the book. And maybe I should mention the form of this one. It's another unusual form. So it's a sonnet, but it's a version of a sonnet that was created. So I have my own terribly titled Will Sonnets. So my great pal Ernie Hilbert has a sonnet that he invented called the Hilbertian sonnet. And Ernie uses this quite a lot. He used it in his first books exclusively, I think, which were called 60 Sonnets and All You on the Good Earth. And he used it also in his wonderful book, Caligulin, that won the Poets Prize the year before Dana Gioia won the Poets Prize, which was the last year. Anyway, circular. So I think that's all that we need to know, right? So the rhyme scheme in an Hilbertian sonnet is ABC, ABC, C, or DEF, DEF, GG. And when Ernie uses this, instead of using an iambic pentameter, he just uses a decasyllabic line. I stick pretty much to a pentameter. I'm not as daring as Ernie is in lots of ways. So this is one of many Centurions. Guilt's funny. Magic, some say. He was kneeling, blindfolded. We took turns and, laughing, punched him, slapped and punched him, daring him to guess our names, a legionary's cloak concealing his eyes, like we could see. Silent, he hunched there, jaws, ribs cracked. We cackled. I confess we thought him something of a pedescule. He wasn't like us. Redneck paradoxes and parables. Seeds, fig trees, wheat and chaff. When backwoods bullies bloodied me in school, I camouflaged my rage. Red as a fox is, awaiting my revenge. I couldn't laugh, though, seeing him, limbs nailed up, crucified, hill dark, blood pouring, his arms open wide.
So now that you've undertaken this this exercise of doing some sort of explicitly, religious poems. I'm not that some of the others aren't explicitly religious. Obviously, Christmas Party is, but things that are, sort of in their entirety, I guess, subjects from the gospel, for instance. This and the poem about the Magi you did, the Feast of the Epiphany. Well, what are your thoughts? What have you, is that something you'll keep doing? What did you sort of discover in undertaking those?
Yeah, so in the book that I mentioned, The Stranger World, none of the speakers are me in really any sense. They're all personae.
Oh, really? Okay.
They're all masks that I'm putting on. They're characters. And of course, in Proteus Bound with the translations, I'm playing a character. I'm playing, Sappho or Charles Baudelaire or Paul Verlaine or whomever it may be. And in this book, in Ghostlight, I'm moving a little toward things that are nearer me, right? The poem about my friend, the poem about my dog. It's getting a little nearer in some cases. But I still feel more comfortable in a persona for whatever reason. It makes it easier for me to get outside of my daily concerns, I think. And anyway, so this is obviously the persona of one of the centurions from the Gospels. And I don't know if I'll keep doing this sort of thing or not. The direction that the more recent poems I'm working on are going is away from the persona and more toward kind of straightforward lyricism, something more like what most people would expect, I think, by a lyric poem, poems that have to do, to whatever extent, with my experiences, but trying to make the personal and historical limitations that I face, trying to move past those toward form, toward a pattern that is applicable for anyone. Right. So, it was a challenge, obviously, when one is dealing with, sacred subject matter. One has to go in fear. I tried with these poems to use basically meditation, more or less in the Ignatian sense of composing the scene, analyzing it, and then trying to, make a resolution based on that. So that's largely what's happening in these religious poems, is they're really sort of meditations in verse. It's a challenge to try to tell these stories in a way that is fresh, but that is not only fresh, that it's not just
Right.
novelty for novelty's sake,
Right.
And I think the ambition is to be something like a footnote to a footnote to a footnote of of the story as it comes down, in Holy Writ. Yeah, it's challenging. We'll see. I'm not a poet that works by concepts. I don't go into writing a poem thinking, what I really want to do is this. I go in and find out what the poem wants to be, and follow it.
That's good.
Yeah.
Okay, so before we move on to the anthology, one more poem from In Ghostlight. And a couple of years ago, I spent a day in Venice, and I got to be honest, I'm not that crazy about it. It just felt like Disneyland to me. It didn't feel like a real place. And then even insofar as I was getting a feel for the history of the place, it just felt like such a city of vanity, even in its historical dimension, but I did love visiting the the basilica and the bones of St. Mark, which are mentioned in this poem, which is titled Disobedience.
Yeah. And you said that well, Thomas, so I'm not going to add on that. I'll just read the poem. Disobedience, Piazza San Marco. Here, at the labyrinth's heart, I find the air is scintillant, just like the postcards show. A dream of light and strict geometries. Where the lagoons receded from the square, gray stones are dazzled with a blinding glow, and crowds wait, wincing in the shimmer's freeze, like marble waiting for some word or spell to conjure limbs to life from lifeless stasis. Or nomads, stunned to find a sudden well amid the endless sands, or an oasis. I feel it. Nightly angst, ennui, and gloom refine the human need for some perfection, some otherwhere, outside routine's dark delves. And here we are, in Europe's drawing room, Napoleon's choicest spot. Sun glares reflection in cafe windows. We can't see ourselves at all, which is, I guess, why we worked out ways to scrounge up the cash, made plans, and took the flights. We've dreamed the us we've dreamed about awaits us here. But no, not here. See, look, Campanile cracked. Venetians flee en masse. The ones stuck here hawk trinkets. For a coin, tourists go chattering by St. Mark's bones and maybe stop a second as they pass, thinking of their rivals back home in Des Moines, to snap some well-posed selfies with their phones. Outside, a blizzard of chivalric white. The seagulls swarm, whirling in clean white air, and then descend like jagged shards of light to peck to death a pigeon in the square, removing flesh until, pink as a tongue, the innards show. The passers-by ignore the wound, the bird. But there's a girl with bread, one not too busy being rich or young, crouched in the square, small, casting morsels for the living ones. A saint, I almost said. It is illegal here to feed a pigeon. Yet she does, quietly. Sure that the law, which holds the bottom lines, the true religion, shall not expunge this world's dark, winged flaw.
Yeah, so that's the language similar to the end of The Problem, which I mentioned earlier. Okay, so let's move on to this anthology that you co-edited with
First,
April
I
Lindner.
want to just show everyone, so please
sure.
buy this.
Yeah, Contemporary Catholic Poetry and Anthology.
And buy this.
Now, I didn't have the chance to read this book, unlike in the Ghostlight, so why don't you tell me about it?
Yeah. So there have been, in recent years, I think a number of people that are interested in trying to put together collections of poems by Catholic poets, contemporary Catholic poets, responding to Dana Gioia's piece, which is now, I guess, 11 or 12 years old, The Catholic Writer Today. And some years ago now, Dana just called me up and asked me if I wanted to take a shot at it and try to put together a definitive anthology of contemporary Catholic poets. And, it's a very daunting task, but I said, okay, when Dana leans on you, one wants to say yes, and so Dana put me in touch with April Lindner, who's in Philly, or teaches in Philly. So we started reading around and trying to read as widely as we could and to discover, as many Catholic poets as we could, and read all their books and try to pick out what we thought were their best poems. And so it was, a great deal of reading, hundreds and hundreds of books. And we had to make a lot of tough calls in terms of, what to include, what to leave out. My friend Sam Hazo is, I think, 96 or 97. He's still publishing books. And, the thought was, well, if we include Sam, Sam started publishing in the 40s or 50s. So then we would have to include, Robert Lowell and Alan Tate and John Berryman and these guys that have been dead for 60 years. And it would just become this enormous thing, and it wouldn't really feel contemporary anymore. So April and I decided, basically we set the cutoff as 1950, born in 1950 or afterward. And, sadly that means, Sam is not in the book. Paul Mariani, another terrific poet, is not in the book. And then we wanted to, we needed a set of criteria, that was the contemporary part. Well, what does Catholic mean? Because so many of our best poets were raised Catholics and are lapsed and and don't identify themselves as being Catholic. So we didn't want to include those. We didn't want to include people who don't think of themselves as being Catholic. That would be sort of pushy and strange. And so it became, born after 1950 and poets who have not, openly disavowed the magisterium, basically.
Right.
And then it was, well, how do we pick, there's still a large number of people. How do we, winnow it down? And the idea was, well, we want to pick people who have, in a sense, this is a very vague phrase, but have crossed over. That is, people who are not just publishing in little tiny magazines, but have, some national reputation, and so we ended up with, I think there are 23 in the book. And as soon as the book was in press, I happened on somebody that I wish very much was in the book, a poet called Philip Metris, that I had not known about at all. And So already I'm thinking, the book is not even officially out. It comes out on the 10th, and I'm already thinking, oh goodness, I wish I could have included this other thing. Invariably, this is the case with anthologies. One wants, everyone will have a reason to complain. That is the fun part of being an editor of an anthology. Is everyone will have a reason to complain. They'll think somebody should be in, somebody shouldn't be in. The selections from this person should actually be these other poems. But, we work pretty hard to pick the poets that seem to us, the best contemporary Catholic poets, and to pick their very best works. And we wanted to do a couple of things that are a little bit unusual in anthologies. One, we wanted to give ample selections. Normally you'll see 2 or 3 poems from somebody in an anthology, and that's helpful. And it's necessary if you're trying to represent lots and lots and lots of people. But we wanted to pick fewer people and give larger selections.
Right,
so that readers really get an entree into the writer. And we provided, fairly substantial little critical biographies for each of the poets, as well as bibliographies, so that if you like a poet, you can track down their books. The other thing that we did that's unusual is we didn't shy away from the long poem. Anthologists are stricken by moral quandary over long poems, because so many of our best poems are long poems, but if you include a long poem, you're taking up pages that could go to including somebody else, and what do you do? Right. But we didn't shy away from that, and so we have a quite long poem called Heart Island by Ned Balbo. It's a wonderful, wonderful sequence. We have a terrific long poem by Kate Daniels called, I believe, Reading Thomas Jefferson in the Months of My Son's Recovery. So there are several very long sequences in here, and it's because I think that these poems are great poems. I think that they're very important poems, and I think their writers need to be better known. More people need to read Ned Balbo, need to know about Kate Daniels, who's just one of our very finest poets. So I wanted to represent their best work, and that meant including long selections. And even then, there were things that were too long. One of Kate's books is called, I believe it's 4 Testimonies is the title. And beautiful, exquisite work. I mean, there are not a lot of poets that I read and I think, how did you do that? Normally I could sort of get there, but with that book from Kate, I think, how on earth did you do that? But some of those poems are 50, 60 pages long, and you just can't reprint something that long. So it's a game of losing all around, but trying to make something that is close to, definitive, close to comprehensive. And I hope, people will receive it as it's intended, which is as a gift. Here's an introduction to a lot of writers that you may not know. Some you may know. Some are very famous. A Dana Gioia, a Marie Howe, a Franz Wright. These are names people know. Julia Alvarez, Carolyn Forche, and some you may not know. And hopefully people will find a lot of things to like.
The book includes some poets who have been on this podcast: Dana Gioia, James Matthew Wilson, you. But I just asked you to pick a few to give as samples, and I'm glad you picked poets that I don't know anything about. I did read the ones that you suggested just so I would have read them in advance, but I'll just let you take the lead here and read and discuss them in any order you want.
Sure. Maybe we'll start with Franz Wright, whom I just mentioned. Franz was a friend of mine who passed away, 9 years ago. Hard to believe. I still have his last voicemail on my phone. It doesn't seem like 9 years. In any case, so Franz is the son of James Wright, who won the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry. Franz also won the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry for his book, Walking to Martha's Vineyard, which was published in 2003 or 4. They're the only father and son that have done that. And Franz, from a very early age, struggled mightily with manic depression, as his father had. He also struggled with drug addiction. He was homeless for periods of time. And in the 90s, he met a lady named Elizabeth Elkers out in Arkansas, where Franz was teaching at the time. And they got married, and Franz converted to Catholicism and cleaned up and started writing the best poems of his life.
Wow.
And these start appearing in a book called The Before Life, which is an Englishing of Charles Baudelaire's poem Le Vie Intérieure. And the poem that I want to read from Franz is from that book, The Before Life. It's called Memoir. Just hope he forgot the address and don't answer the phone for a week. Put out all the lights in the house. Behave like you aren't there. If some night, when it's blizzarding, you see Franz Wright arrive on your street with his suitcase of codeine pills, lugging that heavy black manuscript of blank texts. So, in some ways, this poem can be hard. It can be hard for me to read his poems. So I'll be brief about this, I think. Here, the key image is the manuscript of blank texts. You say, well, what is this? First, that's a paradox, a blank text, right? Either there's text or the page is blank.
Right.
Here, there's no text, it's blank. It's just white space, like the blizzard that's outside. There's nothing there. What is this manuscript? Well, the title of the poem gives it to us. Memoir. That's his memoir. His memoir is an empty book. There's nothing in it. Why is there nothing in it? Because he's driven everyone away from him. He's pushed people away. And precisely that's what's happening in this poem, pointing at the cyclical nature of this isolation, which is tied to addiction, as he mentions the codeine pills. He's pushed everyone away. And so the mood of the sentences is imperative, right? Not indicative, not interrogative, it's imperative. Just hope he forgot the address and don't answer the phone for a week. Put out all the lights in the house. Behave like you aren't there. He's telling everyone to ignore him. And he's not just anyone, but it's his friends, people whose addresses he knows.
Right.
He's pushing them away, telling them to ignore him if he should reach out. And so we see this poem getting deep into the psyche of the addict that pushes people away.
Right.
And the echo of the blank texts and the image of the blizzarding, the way that he uses himself in the third person, right? We see this distancing of the self that often happens in addicts who are one person when they're sober and one person when they're not. It's just beautifully rendered. It's very powerfully rendered. And
right. Yeah, I was thinking about the blizzard image of the echoing the white paper and the isolation of this figure walking through the blizzard surrounded by nothing but just blankness, you know.
Yeah, and that's a thing that, that Franz lived through. And what's remarkable is being able to turn that pain into a work of art that transcends his personal limitations, that gets at this thing that's very common of this isolation. One of the last things that I remember him saying to me is on the phone is he said, I miss my guys, because his guys were either dead or he pushed everybody away. So pretty heartbreaking.
Yeah. But there's some beautiful poems by him in the collection of, more redemptive poems as well. And,
Yes.
Poems involving one set right before his conversion, I guess. I don't know the exact timeline, but that's what it seemed like. So some beautiful, uplifting stuff. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Franz is a poet who explored inner darkness in a way that's reminiscent of Charles Baudelaire, whom he thought was the greatest of all French poets, or of Arthur Rimbaud, but he also came out of it to some extent. And one of my favorite passages in the first poem of the book that won the Pulitzer, called Walking to Martha's Vineyard, the poem is called Year One. And the last 3 lines, it's, I think, the best line break in English. He addresses God. He says, "Proof of your existence, there is nothing," line break, "but." There is nothing but.
Yeah.
Beautiful discovery. So yes, not everything is doom and gloom, but Franz was not afraid of the darkness, and it's important that we face it.
You included his poem about Baudelaire in there, and that was interesting too because we've talked about Baudelaire a little bit before, but actually, now that I think of it, it makes me think of your Orpheus poem, right? Because he is, even though he's a fan of Baudelaire as a poet, he's sort of tearing down some of the self mythology or the self image of Baudelaire, and he says there's some line in there, something like evil is basically like a mask for misery to try to make your misery more interesting, so, something like that.
Right.
Paraphrasing, but
yeah,
that was very interesting.
And Baudelaire, as with I think many people, turned to evil precisely for that reason. That there's what seems like a death wish, but it's not really a wish to die. It's a wish to live more fully. Living is a far cry from just breathing. And it's this desire for life and feeling hemmed in and trapped. And people sort of twisting around, not knowing what to do, they'll act out and go toward evil as a way to try to feel alive. And it results in, phrase that Franz uses in that poem is a dark glamour that we tend to sort of be fascinated by those who really commit to evil. There is this dark glamour. There's this mystery. Milton's onto it, and that's why his Satan is so interesting in Paradise Lost.
I like how there's a way to sort of deflate that as well, to like recognize that and deflate it. And I think that's an important step. We can't just like stop with like, oh, evil's so fascinating, but we shouldn't go there. They actually have to deflate the pretense of it as well, which I think it's admirable that, given his admiration for Baudelaire as a poet, he was able to do that in that poem.
Right.
So who's next?
Well, since I mentioned Kate Daniels earlier, maybe I'll read one of Kate's poems. She's such a wonderful poet. Everyone in here, I think, is just delightful. But really hope people will look into not just this book, but the poets in here. Seek them out if you like them. Pick up their individual volumes. So the poem I'll read is called "The Playhouse." Maybe I'll preface it by saying, in the 20th century, we saw a number of really outstanding, widely celebrated poems about fathers. Right. So Theodore Retke's "My Papa's Waltz," Robert Hayden's "Those Winter Sundays," Sylvia Plath's "Daddy," Yusef Komunyaka's "My Father's Love Letters." These are all incredible poems. Somehow there seem to be fewer poems of that caliber about mothers. Strange. I'm sure that there must be. This is one. This is a poem about a mother. It's called "The Playhouse." My dolls came alive in it. All of them, whining in unison. And there was a pink curtain. I'd part it and see your hand flailing in the bedroom window, beckoning me in. But my dolls needed me too, wetting their little diapers, mewing "Mama" whenever I thumped their stomachs. I pretended my hair was long, like yours, draped a black towel over my head, and nuzzled the dollies till it fell over them, covering their faces. Each of us in our houses. I thought of you, combing your hair before the mirror, chatting about men who had loved you, how my father was a fool, what you wished you had done. I never knew why you wanted me. I was alone out there. I loved you, away from the specter of your black hair gleaming in the mirror, your lovely face talking to itself. That poem that poem is a dagger, and the subtlety of the imagery, the implications about this mother-daughter relationship, that the daughter is not real to the mother, and also with the cyclical nature of that the speaker covers her head with a black towel, and it covers her doll's faces, dominating the dolls the way that she's been, and it gets at this cyclical sort of generational pain being passed down. I think this is just a marvelous poem, and I could go on and on about it, but maybe I'll leave it there. And this is one I hope people will spend a lot of time with. It's just a terrific poem, and read it in conjunction with those great father poems. It's as good as any of them, I think. Yeah,
great.
So let's see. Who else? Thomas, had we talked about?
I think they got two more that you selected, and one of them I think was
Orlando. Orlando Menes, who is at Notre Dame, and a wonderful, wonderful poet. I was fortunate to run several of his newer poems from his most recent book, and some newer things in Literary Matters. And the poem I'll read here is a prose poem, which is in some ways a sort of paradox or a kind of nonsense. It's a thing that can't be, and yet can be if it's done with a very particular angle, where the form is a form and it's not just some stuff in a paragraph. But the choice of the prose poem, I think, is very important for this. It would not be as good if it were in lines. So Orlando Menes was born in Peru to parents who were Cuban, and many of his poems have to deal with Cuba. As a teenager, he also lived in Franco's Spain, so he sort of experienced the worst of both sides. But here we have a speaker that I think listeners will probably be able to tell who this is. The title of the poem is "The Maximum Leader Addresses His Island Nation." And so we have a monologue here from the maximum leader addressing his island nation. For half a century, we have triumphed at war and insurrection, our legions victorious across the continents. The capitalist hordes succumb like ants to our Katyushas and Kalashnikovs. Our breath is napalm, our sweat nitroglycerin, our children's lullaby, fatherland or death. Despite these martial glories, we are a poor island between the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn. Winds betray us in the rainy season. Droughts curse every 9 years. Why should geography imprison us? I hereby decree that we are no longer tropical. Cut down the palms, my countrymen. Raise the mangroves. uproot the papaya trees. Let barbed wire brambles cover our valleys. Steel conifers with grenades line our boulevards. After burning down the cornfields, dredging the rice sloughs, trampling every manioc hollow, you will sow rye with gunpowder, seed barley in bombshells. Because life is not a carnival, but a wake of reason, you will not tell spicy jokes, play dominoes, or gyrate to drums. The polka will be our national dance. All food boiled and bland. Our homes will have fireplaces and no fans. Windows sealed, verandas torn, parasols outlawed. You will wear wool coats and sheepskin boots, long johns, earmuffs too. Whoever faints or complains will be shot on sight. I will institute a 10-year plan in which every scientist and sorcerer will wage war on the tropics. Meanwhile, you will walk through drifts of plastic snow, dry ice cobbles, pretending to shiver, pretending that breath freezes in air, pretending that Arctic winds crackle your face.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that one.
Sorry, you kind of have to put on a
Yeah,
a voice
no, I
thing.
enjoyed that. That it's you know it's a great satire of you could say communist, but just or totalitarian or ideological approach to reality, which is to remake reality, and
Yes.
it's as useless to try to remake human nature or even society at a basic level as it is to try to completely change the climate, the geography of a place or something like that, or you could also look at it like trying to from the flip side of like trying to uh turn some totally foreign country into a democracy or something like that, and people are trying to do this kind of stuff all the time, right? It's like we can just impose a whole new set of conditions on
Right.
this people who have been living a certain way for centuries.
Yeah, I mean it's about playing God, right?
Right.
It's the story of the Tower of Babel, right? In the beginning of Genesis, God creates the world. At the end of Genesis, man tries to build something to make himself a god, to ascend up to the heavens, and it's a version of that, trying to play God.
Right.
So yeah, just a terrific poem, and I'm a little unnerved by how easily I got into that ranting voice.
No,
That's maybe
that was
not a good thing.
great. Can you say anything more about the prose poem idea? Because I'm still not quite understanding how that
Yeah.
works.
So the prose poem is really invented by Monsieur Baudelaire, whom we've been discussing
Right.
in Spleen de Paris, the Paris Spleen or Paris Blues.
So
And-
what makes it different from just beautifully written prose?
Right. So in Baudelaire, the idea is that the infinite is sort of trapped in the finite. The lyrical poetry is trapped in prose. It's a comment on people, especially the poor, being trapped in 1850s Paris.
Okay.
Right. So Rimbaud will extend this notion in his masterpiece, On Saison en Enfer, A Season in Hell, where the idea is something like the lyric poet is trapped in time, and time itself is a kind of hell. And Rimbaud, he tried to become an angel. He literally tried to make himself an angel and transcend the human position. And as a result, he of course ended up in hell. And so it's a fascinating study, but it's this notion of the spirit being trapped in time, being trapped in a body, and yearning to transcend.
Okay.
So the great prose poems do something like that, right? They're playing on the possibility of poetry. So very famously, one of my former teachers, Claudia Rankin, had a book called Citizen that made a big splash about 10 years ago, and mostly in prose poems. And the idea was that it's impossible to write lyric poems. Well, I think what Orlando is doing in this poem is something a little bit similar, but with a satirical edge on it. That in this mindset, where the mind itself is trying to be God, right? Where the self is trying to be God, very much as what happens with Rimbaud. When the self is trying to be God, that what happens is the possibility of poetry vanishes, because poetry is an encounter with creation, with something outside of the mind's own making, right?
And it's precisely the body that creates meter and all that stuff. So that doesn't even make sense to try to escape, anyway.
Well, exactly, right? And going back to what we were talking about, even with the dog poem, right? That when we stay locked in the Weltbild that we have constructed, the world we've made, and we don't encounter the world outside there, the possibility of poetry goes away. Poetry is always an encounter with the reality beyond us, which Catholic poets, people in this anthology, would say is a sacramental reality that is signing toward the divine. So I think Orlando's poem is not just a political satire, it's also, in a sense, satirizing the mind that wants to replace God with itself.
So is this a form that really can only exist as a comment? It's not like it can't be like a neutral poetic form, do you think?
Well, I don't know. One doesn't want to say what poetic forms can and can't do, because a poet will come along and do the thing that you say that can't be done.
Well, does this poet normally write prose poems,
No.
or is this something he selected particularly for this occasion?
Yes. Yeah. Orlando is such a versatile poet. He really is capable of doing so many things. He's capable of writing in traditional verse forms very adroitly. He's capable of writing in so-called free verse very adroitly. He can write the prose poem, obviously. He's just incredibly versatile. I would say usually the prose poem will be a comment, right? It needs verse to prop it up. In a sense, it's a kind of response to verse, or an anti.
Unless it's just by someone who's doesn't really know what poetry is and has never learned, and thinks poetry is just words arranged beautifully and has never learned form. I guess there's probably a lot of things that amount to a little more than prose,
that's
right?
Just prose, yeah.
But that's not the same as a prose poem by somebody who really knows what they're doing, right?
Right. Yeah, I mean, the prose poem, one way you might think about it, the prose poem offers itself to liminality in the way of the versicle de lien, but there's less of the lyrical uplift, right? With the versicle de lien, with the will sonnets, we're keeping a rhyme scheme, so there's a sense of a verse form, even as the lines may move toward prose. With the prose poem, you lose some of that tension, but the very concept of a prose poem means that the form wants to be in some way liminal. Anyway, there's lots to learn about that, but I don't want to give it away, because I'm teaching a class right now on poetic meter for Catholic literary arts. And in the spring, I hope to do a sequel addressing the invention of free verse and the prose poem and all these things.
Okay, so I think your last selection was Marie Howe.
Yeah, so and it's a handsome segue there. So Marie Howe is one of my absolute favorite contemporary poets, and she's got a book that's just out, a selected poems volume that's just out, that is beautiful, really, really handsomely made. And the poems that she writes, well, I say it makes a handsome segue precisely because what Marie Howe wants to do is write a line that looks and sounds, on first encounter, it sounds prosaic. But in her best poems, there will be sort of luminous detail, a turn in the poem that helps us, when we go back and reread it, everything that seemed pedestrian and plain and prosaic lifts up and becomes part of a constellation of meaning. It starts to shine beyond itself, right? So she's a poet for whom the sacramental nature of reality is essential to understanding her project. She doesn't use traditional forms. She rarely will use a rhyme. She writes these long lines that often sound like prose, but the idea informing Marie Howe's poems is that even in the seemingly mundane, in the seemingly prosaic, in the seemingly pedestrian and boring, that there is still grace, that there is still beauty. God as the ground of all being. One of the transcendent attributes of God is beauty, and there is beauty in being if we see it, if we open our eyes to see it. And what her poems want to do is to help us to see the beauty in the everyday, that conjunction of the infinite and the finite that Baudelaire would recognize. And so in some ways, she's really an ambitious technician. In fact, to understand her poems, we have to understand this technique. Otherwise, it just looks like some lines, but there's ingenious form to these poems, even though they're not using regular meter or rhyme. So I'll close with this poem called Prayer. Every day, I want to speak to you. And every day, something more important calls for my attention. The drugstore, the beauty products, the luggage I need to buy for the trip. Even now, I can hardly sit here among the falling piles of paper and clothing. The garbage trucks outside already screeching and banging. The mystics say you are as close as my own breath. Why do I flee from you? My days and nights pour through me like complaints and become a story I forgot to tell. Help me. Even as I write these words, I am planning to rise from the chair as soon as I finish this sentence.
Nice.
That space that I was talking about earlier, right? To speak with God, to rehearse what's happening in our lives, to think about what we're doing and why we're doing it, to think about what we want, what we desire, whom we are serving with our actions every day. Those spaces for reflection and meditation are essential. And not just for Catholics, for everyone. We need these spaces to cultivate an inner life. When we don't have these, our lives become stories we forgot to tell. And we're just sort of swept along by whatever, advertisers or influencers, are filling our minds. And sentence there is sort of doubly loaded. As soon as I finish this sentence, the sentence at the end of the poem, but also this punishment. This punishment we impose on ourselves, doing things that we don't want to do. Why do we do them? Obviously, there's some things that we have to do that we don't want to do, but behaviors that we know, are not good for us, and people just go back to doing them. So I encourage everyone, all these poets, are just marvelous, but Marie Howe, really a terrific poet, and her selected poems is just out. I want to say it's from Canop for FSG, but I encourage you to pick it up.
Great. Well, I've heard the name of Franz Wright many times, never checked him out, and now I will for sure after reading some of the selections in the book. So.
Oh, good. Yeah. With Franz, there's so much wonderful stuff. I would say the places to start are the Before Life and Walking to Martha's Vineyard. And then you can sort of go back. I can't remember if he's FSG or Knopf either, but whichever one. They issued several of his earlier books all together as earlier poems. You can kind of go back and then trace how did he get to those books. That's the order I would recommend.
Great. Okay, cool. Well, yeah, I'll link in the description for people to buy both these books in Ghostlight and Contemporary Catholic Poetry. Great. Yeah, Ryan, thank you so much. This was a very rich conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Thomas. It's always fun to talk. And only 2 hours this time instead of 3.5.
That's right. Yeah. Awesome. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. God bless, Thomas.
The Catholic Culture Podcast is a production of CatholicCulture.org. Check out our other podcasts, including Way of the Fathers, an early church history podcast hosted by Jim Papandrea, Catholic Culture audiobooks bringing to life classic Catholic writings, and Criteria, the Catholic film podcast featuring deep analysis of great films from a Catholic perspective. You'll find all of this, as well as Catholic news, commentary, liturgical year resources, and much more at CatholicCulture.org.